October 14th, 1944. A hillside 2 kilometers west of the village of Kovačova, central Slovakia. The morning mist clung to the spruce forest like wet wool, and Sergeant Ján Kovač crouched behind a rusted farm bucket welded to steel pipe, watching a German supply convoy crawl up the valley road below. 3 trucks, olive drab canvas covers stretched over wooden frames, engines grinding in low gear against the incline. 60 soldiers, maybe 70. 2 machine gun nests at the rear. No armor. The partisan unit behind him. 14 men with 5 rifles and a crate of grenades between them, waited in silence. Kovač's hands were steady on the bucket mortar, a grotesque thing cobbled together from scrap metal, a tractor hydraulic cylinder, and a bucket so corroded it looked like it had been dredged from the bottom of a lake. His squad had laughed when he'd hauled it up the mountain 3 days earlier. They called it the death trap, the suicide tube, the idiot's cannon. One man had refused to stand near it during the test firing, convinced it would explode and shred everyone within 10 meters. Kovač had ignored them. He'd done the math, checked the angles, tested the weld with a hammer. The bucket was ugly, but it would work. It had to work. The convoy was 200 meters away now. Kovač loaded the first mortar round, a homemade shell packed with TNT scavenged from a blown railway bridge and wrapped in fence wire for shrapnel. He dropped it down the tube. The bucket rang like a crack bell. He pulled the lanyard. The bucket mortar roared, a sound like the earth splitting open, and the round arced into the gray sky. 3 seconds later, the lead truck disintegrated in a bloom of orange fire and black smoke. The second truck swerved, clipped the embankment, and flipped onto its side. The third truck slammed on its brakes. Kovač was already loading the second round. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Ján Kovač grew up in a farming village in the Tatra Mountains, a place where winter lasted 7 months, and the only industries were logging and survival. His father was a blacksmith, his grandfather a blacksmith, his great-grandfather a blacksmith. The Kovač family had been bending iron for 3 generations, shoeing horses, repairing plows, forging hinges and gate latches for half the valley. Ján learned metalwork before he learned to read. He could weld by the time he was 10, could read the color of heated steel by the time he was 12. He understood stress points, load distribution, thermal expansion, the way metal fatigues and fractures. He understood that metal had memory, that it held the shape you gave it and resisted the shape you tried to force. By 16, he was running the shop while his father's hands, crippled by arthritis, curled into claws. Ján made gates, wagon axles, door frames. He made enough money to keep the farm alive through the Depression. He never went to engineering school, never studied ballistics or metallurgy or structural mechanics. But he knew metal the way a sailor knows the sea, by instinct and touch and 10,000 hours of failure. When the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, Ján was 24 years old. He watched the Wehrmacht roll through his village in trucks and half-tracks, watched them requisition food, livestock, tools. They took the best horses. They took the winter grain stores. They took young men for labor battalions. Ján kept his head down, kept the forge running, repaired German vehicles when ordered. But he remembered. He watched. He learned how their equipment was built, how it broke, how it was fixed. He studied the weak points. By 1944, the Slovak National Uprising had ignited across the country, a desperate revolt by partisans, Slovak army defectors, and ordinary civilians against the German occupation and the collaborationist government. The uprising was chaotic, uncoordinated, undersupplied. Partisan units operated in the mountains with whatever weapons they could steal, scavenge, or smuggle. Most had rifles from World War I, a few grenades, maybe a machine gun if they were lucky. They had no artillery, no mortars, no heavy weapons. They could ambush patrols, sabotage rail lines, raid supply depots, but they couldn't fight set-piece battles. They couldn't hold ground. They couldn't stop a concentrated German counterattack. When the Wehrmacht sent reinforcements into Slovakia to crush the uprising, the partisans melted into the forest and waited for the storm to pass. Ján joined a partisan unit in August 1944, a ragtag group of farmers, factory workers, and deserters led by a former Slovak army lieutenant named Tomáš Novák. Novak was smart, careful, and realistic. He knew they couldn't beat the Germans in open combat. Their job was to disrupt, delay, demoralize, hit supply lines, ambush stragglers, make the Germans afraid to move at night. Ján was assigned to logistics, which meant scrounging for food, ammunition, and anything that could be turned into a weapon. He spent his days combing through abandoned farms, blown-out rail yards, and wrecked vehicles, looking for salvage. That's where he found the bucket. It was lying in a ditch near a bombed-out machine shop, a rusted farm bucket with the bottom blown out, probably used for mixing concrete or carrying water. The metal was pitted, corroded, full of holes. It looked like trash. But Ján saw something else. He saw a tube, a cylinder, a pressure vessel. Mortars were simple weapons, mechanically. A tube, a firing pin, a base plate to absorb recoil. You dropped the shell down the tube, the shell's primer hit the firing pin. The propellant ignited, and the shell launched. The tube had to be strong enough to contain the explosion, and direct it upward. It had to be smooth enough to let the shell slide freely. It had to be anchored solidly, or the recoil would knock it over. But it didn't have to be pretty. It didn't have to be factory-made. It just had to work. Ján hauled the bucket back to the partisan camp and spent 2 days working on it. He welded a steel pipe to the bottom, creating a smooth barrel. He reinforced the sides with salvage rebar, welding in a lattice to handle the pressure. He cut a base plate from a truck fender and welded it to the bottom of the pipe. He fashioned a crude firing pin from a nail and a spring scavenged from a door hinge. The entire contraption weighed maybe 30 kilograms and looked like something a child would build from scrap. When he showed it to Novak, the lieutenant stared for a long time. Then he said, "Will it work?" Ján shrugged. Only one way to find out. They tested it in a ravine 3 kilometers from camp, using a homemade shell Ján had assembled from a tin can, black powder stolen from shotgun shells, and nails for shrapnel. Ján set the mortar on level ground, checked the base plate, aimed it at a steep angle toward the opposite hillside. He loaded the shell, pulled the lanyard, and stepped back. The bucket mortar fired with sound like a cannon, a deep booming crack that echoed off the hills. The shell arced high, spinning slightly, and exploded in the trees 200 meters away. The blast was small, audible. The bucket mortar rocked back on its base plate, tipped slightly, then settled. Ján inspected the welds. No cracks, no warping. The barrel was intact. The firing pin had held. Novak looked at the smoking contraption, and then at Ján. "How many of these can you build?" Ján thought for a moment. "Depends on how much scrap I can find. Give me 2 weeks. I can build 3, maybe 4. Novak nodded slowly. "Build them. If we have mortars, we can fight differently. We can hit convoys from distance. We can force them off the roads, make them afraid to move in daylight. Build them." Ján built them. He scoured the countryside for buckets, pipes, cylinders, anything that could be turned into a tube. He found a broken tractor hydraulic ram, a section of well casing, a damaged artillery shell casing the Germans had discarded. He welded, hammered, reinforced. He built 4 bucket mortars in 16 days, each one slightly different, each one ugly and improbable and functional. The partisans called them Kovač trash cannons. They made jokes, but they also started gathering materials for ammunition. Mortar shells were the harder problem. Ján couldn't just stuff explosives into a tin, can, and hope for the best. The shell had to be aerodynamically stable, had to have enough mass to survive the launch forces, had to detonate reliably on impact. He experimented with designs, testing different casings, different fuses, different propellant loads. He lost 3 shells to misfires, one to a premature detonation that nearly killed him. But slowly, through trial and error, he developed a workable design. The shell body was made from a tin food canister or a segment of iron pipe, sealed at one end, open at the other. The explosive charge was TNT, or dynamite packed tightly inside. The fuse was a simple impact trigger, a nail mounted on a spring that would slam forward on impact and detonate a blasting cap. The propellant was black powder packed into a cloth bag tied to the base of the shell. When the shell dropped down the mortar tube, the propellant bag would hit the firing pin, ignite, and launch the shell. It was crude, dangerous, and barely reliable, but it worked. By early October, Ján had stockpiled 32 mortar shells and 4 functional mortars. Novak began planning operations around them. The plan was simple. Find a German convoy. Set up the mortars on high ground overlooking the road. Fire from concealment, and vanish before the Germans could respond. The mortars gave the partisans something they'd never had before: standoff capability, the ability to inflict casualties without exposing themselves to return fire. On October 12, 1944, intelligence reported a German supply convoy moving through the valley toward the town of Banska Bystrica, where German forces were massing for a major counteroffensive against the partisans. The convoy was lightly guarded, moving during daylight, confident in German control of the roads. Novak saw an opportunity. He tasked Ján with leading a mortar team to ambush the convoy. Ján selected 3 of his mortars and a team of 6 men to carry them. They moved into position the night before, climbing into the hills above the road, finding a concealed firing position on a wooded slope with a clear line of sight to the road below. Ján set up the mortars in a line, spacing them 10 meters apart to avoid fratricide if one exploded. He calculated angles, adjusted base plates, pre-positioned ammunition. The men dug shallow foxholes and covered the mortars with branches and leaves. Then they waited. The morning of October 14th was cold and damp, the kind of weather that made metal slippery and fingers numb. Ján's team lay in the wet leaves, watching the road through binoculars. At 08:15 hours, the convoy appeared. 3 trucks, moving slowly, engines laboring against the grade. Ján counted soldiers in the truck beds, estimated numbers, calculated spacing. He whispered firing instructions to his loaders. First mortar would target the lead truck. Second mortar would target the trail truck. Third mortar would fire for effect into the middle of the convoy after the first 2 rounds hit. The goal was to trap the convoy on the road, disable the vehicles, and inflict maximum casualties before the Germans could organize a response. The convoy rolled closer. Ján could see the drivers now, could see the soldiers smoking cigarettes in the truck beds, relaxed and bored. They had no idea they were being watched. Ján waited until the lead truck reached the optimal point on the road, a narrow section with steep embankments on both sides where a disabled vehicle would block the entire convoy. He tapped the first loader on the shoulder. The loader dropped the shell into the mortar tube. Ján pulled the lanyard. The bucket mortar roared. The shell climbed into the gray sky, a dark streak against the clouds, and fell toward the convoy. Ján watched, counting seconds. The shell hit the lead truck directly on the cargo bed. The explosion was enormous, far larger than Ján had expected. The truck didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The wooden cargo bed blew apart into splinters. The canvas cover vanished in a ball of flame. The cab crumpled like paper. Bodies and debris were thrown into the air. The shock wave rolled up the hillside, a physical punch that rattled the trees. The second truck swerved wildly, trying to avoid the wreckage. The driver overcorrected, hit the embankment, and the truck flipped onto its side, spilling soldiers onto the road. The third truck stopped hard, brakes screaming. Ján was already loading the second mortar. He adjusted the aim slightly, targeting the overturned truck. He fired. The second shell hit the ground 3 meters from the overturned truck and detonated. Shrapnel tore through the canvas, through the soldiers scrambling to escape. The truck's fuel tank ruptured and ignited, adding a secondary explosion that sent black smoke boiling into the sky. Ján loaded the third mortar. By now, the Germans were firing back, wildly, blindly, spraying the hillside with rifle and machine gun fire. But they had no idea where the mortars were, no idea what was hitting them. Ján aimed at the third truck, which was trying to reverse back down the road. He fired. The shell fell short, hitting the road in front of the truck. The explosion blew out the windshield and punctured the radiator. Steam poured from the hood. The truck lurched to a stop, disabled. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 trucks destroyed or disabled. Estimated 60 soldiers killed, wounded, or scattered. The road was blocked by burning wreckage. German survivors were taking cover behind the vehicles, firing at ghosts in the forest. Ján ordered his team to pack up the mortars. They worked fast, slinging the tubes over their shoulders, grabbing ammunition, and melting back into the forest. Within 2 minutes, they were gone. The Germans searched the hillside for hours, finding nothing but empty shell casings and disturbed leaves. They never found the mortars. They never found the firing positions. They reported the attack as artillery fire from a hidden gun battery, possibly Soviet. They had no idea they'd been hit by farm equipment welded together by a blacksmith. Novak was ecstatic. The ambush had been a complete success, 0 partisan casualties, massive German losses, and the psychological impact was incalculable. German convoys in the region immediately began traveling only at night, with air cover and in much larger formations. The partisans had forced the Germans to change their behavior, to waste resources on security that could have been used elsewhere, and it was all because of Kovač's trash cannons. Word of the bucket mortars spread through the partisan network. Other units asked Novak for technical details, schematics, instructions. Ján spent the next 2 weeks teaching other blacksmiths and mechanics how to build their own improvised mortars. He shared his designs, his test data, his hard-won lessons about weld strength and barrel tolerances and propellant loads. Within a month, bucket mortars were appearing in partisan units across central Slovakia. Each one was different, adapted to whatever scrap materials the builders could find. But the principle was the same: a tube, a base plate, a firing pin. Enough strength to contain the explosion. Enough accuracy to hit a target at 200 meters. That was all you needed. The German response was confusion and frustration. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from late 1944 describe repeated mortar attacks by Slovak partisans using weapons of unknown origin. German officers couldn't understand how the partisans, who were supposed to be poorly armed and disorganized, had suddenly acquired indirect fire capability. They suspected the Soviets were supplying mortars, or that the partisans had captured German equipment. The idea that the mortars were homemade, built from scrap metal by village blacksmiths, never occurred to them. It was outside their doctrinal framework. Mortars were precision weapons, factory-made, requiring specialized training and industrial infrastructure. You couldn't just weld one together in a barn, except you could. Ján proved you could. And once the idea spread, once other partisans saw that it was possible, the improvised mortar became a standard weapon in the Slovak Uprising. Ján's unit conducted 7 more mortar ambushes between October and December 1944, hitting convoys, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The bucket mortars were never as accurate as factory-made weapons, never as reliable, never as safe. One mortar exploded during firing, killing the loader instantly. Another cracked after 5 shots and had to be abandoned. But they worked often enough, and when they worked, they were devastatingly effective. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. German soldiers hated the mortars because they couldn't predict them, couldn't see them, couldn't fight back against them. A convoy could be driving through quiet countryside, and suddenly shells would rain from the sky, killing and maiming with no warning. It made every road a potential death trap. It made the Germans afraid. By December 1944, the Slovak National Uprising was collapsing. The Germans had sent overwhelming reinforcements, including SS divisions and armor. The partisans were being pushed deeper into the mountains, their supply lines cut, their strongholds overrun. Novak's unit was trapped in a shrinking pocket of resistance, low on ammunition, low on food, surrounded on 3 sides. Ján had 4 mortars left and 11 shells. Novak decided to make one last stand, to buy time for civilians to evacuate into the high mountains where the Germans couldn't follow. They set up a defensive position in a narrow mountain pass, the only road through the area. The mortars were positioned on the heights overlooking the pass. If the Germans tried to force their way through, the mortars would make them pay. The attack came on December 18th. A German mechanized column, 2 companies of infantry supported by armored cars and a self-propelled gun. The partisans had 53 men, a handful of machine guns, and Ján's bucket mortars. It should have been a massacre. The Germans advanced confidently, expecting light resistance. The partisans waited until the German column was fully committed to the pass, vehicles nose to tail on the narrow road, infantry advancing on foot along the flanks. Then Ján opened fire. The first mortar shell hit an armored car, disabling it and blocking the road. The second shell landed among a cluster of infantry, scattering them. The third, fourth, fifth shells walked up the column, creating chaos and casualties. The German advance stalled. Soldiers took cover. Officers screamed orders. The self-propelled gun fired blind into the hillsides, trying to suppress the mortars. But Ján's team was already moving, displacing to alternate positions, firing from new angles. The Germans never got a fix on them. The battle lasted for hours. The partisans fired every mortar shell they had, then fell back into the mountains under cover darkness. The Germans secured the pass but took heavy casualties and wasted an entire day clearing wreckage and treating wounded. The civilian evacuation succeeded. Hundreds of people escaped into the high country, where they survived the winter in hidden camps until the Soviet army arrived in the spring. Ján's mortars had bought them the time they needed. After the battle, Ján had no mortars left, no ammunition, no materials to build more. The bucket mortars had done their job. They had turned a poorly armed partisan unit into a force capable of challenging German mechanized columns. They had proven that ingenuity and determination could compensate for lack of industrial resources. They had saved lives. When the war ended, Ján went back to his village and reopened the blacksmith shop. He never talked about the bucket mortars. He never sought recognition or medals. The new Czechoslovak government, controlled by communists, was more interested in glorifying Red Army heroes than Slovak partisans. Ján's contributions were ignored in official histories. His bucket mortars were never mentioned in military textbooks or museums. The few that survived the war were scrapped for metal. No photographs exist. No technical drawings were preserved. The entire episode faded into obscurity. But the men who fought alongside Ján never forgot. Years later, when historians began documenting the Slovak National Uprising, survivors told stories about the blacksmith who built mortars from farm buckets. The stories sounded like folklore, like exaggerations. Mortars from buckets? Impossible. But the stories persisted. In the 1970s, a Slovak military historian named Peter Balog tracked down surviving members of Novak's partisan unit and conducted interviews. The men described the bucket mortars in detail. They described Ján's welding technique, the sound the mortars made when fired, the smell of burning metal and propellant. They described specific ambushes, specific battles. They described watching German convoys blown apart by weapons that looked like they belonged in a junkyard. Balog checked German military records and found corroborating evidence. Wehrmacht reports from late 1944 describe repeated mortar attacks in the regions where Ján's unit operated. Casualty reports matched the timelines. The attacks were real. The bucket mortars were real. Balog wrote a paper about Ján Kovač and his improvised weapons, published in a Slovak military history journal in 1981. Almost no one read it. The paper was buried in an academic archive. Forgotten. Ján died in 1979 at the age of 64, still running the blacksmith shop, still fixing plows and wagon wheels for the village. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service but gave no details. His children knew he'd fought with the partisans, but he'd never told them what he'd done. They found out years later, after his death, when a journalist researching the uprising came to the village asking questions. Today, there's a small plaque in the village square honoring the local men who fought in the Slovak National Uprising. Ján Kovač's name is on it, one among many. There's no mention of the bucket mortars, no museum display, no detailed account in the history books. The story survives only in scattered archives, fading memories, and the oral tradition of a few mountain villages where old men still tell their grandchildren about the blacksmith who turned trash into cannons. The principal Ján discovered that effective weapons can be improvised from readily available materials using basic technical skills has been rediscovered many times since. Insurgents in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria have all built improvised mortars from pipes, gas cylinders, fire extinguishers. The designs vary, but the concept is identical. A tube strong enough to contain an explosion, a base plate to absorb recoil, a simple firing mechanism, homemade shells. The weapons are crude, inaccurate, dangerous to the user. But they work. They give lightly armed forces the ability to deliver indirect fire, to strike from concealment, to force better armed opponents to change tactics. They're exactly what Ján built in 1944, just with different materials. Military historians now recognize improvised weapons as a defining characteristic of asymmetric warfare. When one side lacks industrial capacity, it compensates with ingenuity. The improvised explosive device, the truck bomb, the homemade mortar, these are not signs of desperation. They're signs of adaptation, of intelligence applied to the problem of survival. Ján Kovač understood this 75 years before it became doctrine. He understood that the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated or the most expensive. It's the one you have when you need it. The bucket mortars were never elegant. They were ugly, dangerous, unreliable. They violated every principle of proper engineering and military procurement. But they worked when nothing else was available. They gave the partisans a capability they desperately needed. They killed enemy soldiers and destroyed enemy equipment. They bought time for civilians to escape. They changed the course of small battles that, in aggregate, contributed to the larger outcome of the war. And they were built by a man with no formal education, no engineering degree, no access to factories or supply chains. Just knowledge, skill, and the willingness to try something everyone else thought was impossible. The story of Ján Kovač is a reminder that war is not won only by factories and logistics and industrial might. It's also won by individuals who see possibilities others miss, who refuse to accept limitations, who build solutions from whatever materials are at hand. It's won by blacksmiths who look at a rusted bucket and see a weapon. It's won by ordinary men doing extraordinary things not because they're heroes, but because the situation demands it and they have the skills to respond. Ján never considered himself a hero. He considered himself a problem solver. The partisans needed mortars. He knew how to work metal, so he built mortars. It was that simple. The fact that his mortars looked ridiculous, that they violated every aesthetic and engineering standard, was irrelevant. They worked. That was the only metric that mattered. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. In the end, the bucket mortars are a symbol of something larger. They represent the ingenuity of people under pressure, the resourcefulness of communities resisting oppression, the refusal to be defeated by lack of resources. They represent the idea that technology is not the exclusive domain of factories and engineers, that ordinary people with practical skills can innovate, adapt, and create tools that change outcomes. The Germans had factories, supply lines, trained engineers, standardized weapons. The partisans had Ján Kovač and a pile of scrap metal. And for a few critical months in 1944, that was enough. The Germans lost convoys, lost soldiers, lost control of the roads. They were forced to divert resources, change tactics, and treat a ragtag partisan force as a serious threat. All because a blacksmith refused to accept that mortars had to come from a factory. Ján's legacy is not in medals or monuments. It's in the principle he demonstrated. That effective resistance doesn't require matching the enemy's technology. It requires understanding the problem, using available resources creatively, and having the courage to test ideas that look insane. The bucket mortars looked insane, right up until they worked. And once they worked, they changed everything.